Good morning, everybody. Almost afternoon. We're just waiting for a couple of people to arrive. I'm Brian Lambie. With me is Andrea Montgomery from Red Brick. And if you punched in, you should be seeing the social media use during a crisis webinar. So we're just getting settled. Hope you are too. We'll start in about 2 or 3 minutes. With me is
Andrea Montgomery.
Also from Red Brick Communications. As many of you know, we have been providing this, designing and developing this webinar series for AMO. There's coming up in the next couple of months. So we're going to dive into these. We have a mix of people from large and small municipalities. So that's going to mean different things for different people in terms of what's helpful here. And we've got a lot of ground that we want to cover. If you have questions as we go, we welcome that. You can ask questions during the chat portion there on your screen. Andrea is going to be making sure that we log all those, and we'll try to make sure we've got time to get to those. So I want to start with just a basic overview of Crisis Communications 101. You know, if you haven't had a deep dive into crisis communication exercises and communications planning and whatnot, these are the standard things that we always say you try to do. Quickly identify the problem, move quickly, respond quickly, frame identify what the issue actually is, and then try to frame it and explain it and contain it. Demonstrate leadership, caring, and compassion. Provide reliable, timely information. Make sure you're looking after your internal needs of your employees, and avoid the temptation to get freaked out, defensive, and angry. So those are basic communications, crisis communications principles that we follow. You'll see that in just about every crisis communications plan. And often when people are talking about crisis communication, this is all you get. They stop here. We're going much, much deeper today as we look at how you use social media. Now, I'm going to tie into some of the other webinars that we use and deliver. And quite frankly, we do two-day workshops, large two-day workshops on crisis communication and crisis management. So you're not going to get all of that. Some of the areas we're going to go through pretty quickly. All right. I do think we need to revisit some of the old rules around crisis communications, and we may have a few emergency managers on, on this call, and that's great. But I have been struck as we go around the province that the emergency management crisis mentality, I think, is a bit dated, particularly if you're outside the 416 area code. So for instance, this notion that, we always want to have one spokesperson. Is that possible in a day and age with social media and counselors? Is it possible if you're a lower tier and you've got shared responsibilities with upper tier and the provincial government? There are times where you're going to have multiple spokespeople that have to be complementary. Will you have a news conference, and will you get your information out through newspapers, radio, and television? A lot of you don't have media anymore, right? You could organize a news conference, and it may be in your crisis plans to do that, but who's going to come to it? Realistically, where are people going to get fast, reliable information? Some of you have very cumbersome approval processes, so we need to think about how we're going to cut through that and make sure that we can respond quickly. All right, so these are all sorts of the things that we're looking at in terms of some adjustments that you may want to make to your existing crisis communications planning, and social media is going to help you out. The benefit of social media, of course, it's fast, easy, inexpensive. It allows you to be the media, particularly in those places that don't have it anymore. The content is readily shareable, so you're crafting a message that's easy to share. And seeing is believing. It's one thing to provide text to people, but when you get images or video, that goes into your long-term memory banks. You process it very quickly, leaves a lasting impression, and people trust it more. So social media provides all those opportunities that traditional crisis communications will not necessarily deliver for you. All right, this last bit here, if we step into, we can step into the role that media once played. I think we also need to recognize that in the absence of media, if you don't fill that vacuum, it will be filled, and you know what that'll look like. Our next webinar after this is
When Facebook attacks.
the last one is, well, the next one is when Facebook attacks. And that's really what we're talking about here. If you allow for a vacuum or you get this wrong, Facebook's going to be a mess and you're going to be in trouble. All right, so everybody, we agree with all that. How do we actually do it? Let's plow ahead with some practical tips. In terms of things that are helpful for you, really, if we were to just focus on 6 things that we'd like you to concentrate, we need to do more planning and preparation, and we're going to show you that it's quite possible to do that. A lot of you probably should. You're all supposed to have a crisis communications plan for your municipality. We often find, normally we find that people don't have that completed or they haven't got to it. So it's often a missing piece, and we understand why. You have limited time. So we're going to look at some things you can do to kind of make time in advance. We want you to keep it really simple. We want to work on your speed, on your ability to communicate much, much faster than you may be comfortable doing now. We want you to move beyond text so that you're using more video, photographs, and images. It's faster and it's more effective. And we want you to work with other communicators. We'll more on that when we get there. And the last piece is we want you to test, learn, adapt, and improve. And really where we're going there is it always surprises us the number of times, and it is normal, I think, that we see municipalities that do operational exercises to test their operational plans in a crisis, and they don't include a communications component in that, or they do a communications exercise separate from that. I think it's a very rude awakening for your emergency managers to have to deal with the operational crisis and the communications pressures at the same time. And if you don't do that, they're going to underestimate just how many people you need to have working on your communications component to make sure it works out for you. So we need you to work that into their plans. All right, how do we do these 6 things? We're going to dive into each one of them. So let's recognize bad things happen. Most of those things are predictable. Almost all of them really are predictable. You know, there isn't something that we haven't seen. Acts of God are incredibly rare. We sit there and we worry about ice storms and floods and all that stuff. But the reality is most crisis situations that we run into are not, it's not this stuff. It's not act of God stuff. It tends to be things that come out of filing cabinets. They're man-made situations. They're political issues, or there's something that got away from us. Now, if you look at them, it can be overwhelming to think, oh my God, of all the things that can go wrong. But by my estimation, well, I mentioned we should have a crisis communications plan. All that should be covered in your plan. But if we look at you know, that key thing that you want to have in the things that you're supposed to do with early identification, you should be able to spot your issues and your crisis situations before they get to the Facebook stage. The reality is we often struggle to do that. Facebook is itself a great early warning tool. When things brew up, Facebook is usually the first one to send a signal that there's a problem. But I'm surprised that often people are not really actively monitoring their local Facebook pages, even though that has replaced traditional media in their community. I find that that's often the case where people don't have a good handle on where the discussions are happening in their community, the most meaningful discussions. Often your elected officials do, but staff tend to shy away from keeping a close eye on those groups and pages. So we want to look at that for early identification. All right, now, a lot of the stuff that we feel is a crisis situation isn't actually a crisis situation, it's an issue. A crisis we define as something that impedes your operation and you can no longer function business as usual. So this is important because if we manage an issue as though it's a crisis, we will create a crisis. So if we have a small fire at a, we send out helicopters and our full massive response, then all the neighbors are going to expect that we are responding to a crisis, and they're going to expect to see a full crisis response, or else we're being inadequate. Similarly, if we look at something like Lake Megantic, and you know, the owner of the rail company gets there and says, well, you know, I've had a bad day too. They're managing a crisis situation as though it's a difficult circumstance that they're running through, rather than something that's threatening to their brand or their operations. So we really need you to understand the difference between the two to make sure you don't get hurt. That's our quick definition. All right, now in terms of all the possible things that could go wrong, and you identify in your, you try to identify them all. You know, in my estimation, there's really only about 20 different types of things that can actually go wrong. It's more manageable than you might think. particularly when we look at all the things that could possibly go wrong, they can actually be grouped with some fairly similar patterns. So you end up with really, if we look at sinkholes, terrorist attacks, fires, explosions, spills, and pollution, those have very similar messaging themes. Rain, flood, wind, ice storm, forest fires, again, similar patterns to the messages that you're going to have. Protests, cyber attacks, service disruptions, labor relations. You're going to say similar things in those kinds of crisis situations. So the more you kind of pick it apart and walk through these, the more you realize that you've got to come up with messaging and scenarios for a handful of different types of emergencies that you're going to deal with, right? So for instance, in 9/11, that was an incredible attack that no one could really anticipate or imagine at the time. And yet they had prepared messaging because they were prepared for anthrax attacks. So the 9/11 messaging they used was just a quick modification of their anthrax attack messaging, and it worked, all right? So some planning around these different types of scenarios is going to help you out. All right, now, in terms of the questions that you're going to get, they also fall into pretty predictable patterns. These are the kinds of things that people have questions about: their health and safety, or the health and safety of first responders. What do I do? Where do I go? What can we expect next? What's the impact on the environment? Where can we get help and assistance? What caused this? Who did this? And then, they're going to look for basic facts, figures, and information. The reality is, for you as a communicator during a crisis situation, you're going to focus on these areas. You're not going to go into what the cause is at this point. That's subject to an investigation. And you're going to resist the temptation to dive into rabbit holes and facts and figures. You're really going to concentrate on basic health and safety instructions, next steps, how you rally assistance for people, and if you're smart, you'll thank your community and staff along the way. All right, so again, if we look at these patterns, it all becomes a lot more manageable. Now that's easy for me to say in a few minutes. When I say that we do full day, like 1 to 2 day training exercises around emergency management communications, this is the stuff we go into in great detail. All right, messaging. I really believe that the more plain language and simple the message is, the more likely you are to get through a situation unscathed. We also often feel overwhelmed in the heat of a moment on something. It pays to look at how you want to be remembered 5 years after the crisis. And usually that'll come up with some keywords, like we want it to be seen as being caring and a rapid response. We figured out what went wrong, we got to the bottom of it, and we made changes to protect it or to change it so that it wouldn't happen again. There's some basic principles that you'll want to be remembered as capturing. Take those words, and you're going to find that they start to build the structure for a compass bearing of the direction you want to go in with your words and your actions. And obviously, have a look at that sign on the wall in terms of what your mission statement, your values statement, those sorts of things, because the spotlight's on you and you want to make sure you're nailing those.
I can give a good example in here too. Is so last summer, city of Bracebridge was preparing for a flood, and then of course they did get quite severe flooding. The way that their mayor, Graydon Smith, managed that, he was probably the most prolific on social media. He had lots, and we have some examples coming up. But this idea of how you want to be remembered 5 years later, all of his messaging was proactive. It was in the moment. It was sincere and authentic. And the other piece to that is there was never moments of blame. So he was very positive throughout all of his response there. He wasn't pointing fingers at anyone and why is this happening? Why is it to this extent? Any of that kind of stuff. It was really all about being solution oriented and being positive for his community. And after the fact, he had countless remarks back from the community thanking him for how he managed that and how he delivered those messages. So it's a powerful thing. And his media coverage was bigger than others that had had similar flooding in the area. And there's a reason for that.
Yeah, we're going to look also at some of the things he did to achieve that.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of messaging and all the section that I just went through, the best way to really make that stick for people is, intensive media training where you're required to come up with messaging in a hurry and answer very difficult questions on camera. And while we often think about doing this for our communications, our spokespeople, key spokespeople, yeah, they definitely should have that. But I'm a firm believer that some of the people that are on this call that are trying to figure out how they'll communicate in a crisis, they also need to experience what it's actually like in front of a camera when you're stressed getting difficult questions. It's going to help you refine your approaches and your messaging to make sure that you're delivering good products for those who need them in a pinch. Okay, so in terms of your communications roles, these are all the kinds of things that they expect a communications person to do during a crisis. They want you to be in meetings, give great advice, write material, make it visual. We want you to take all the media requests that are coming in at exactly the same half-hour window often. They want you to follow social media and respond to social media, look after the needs of council, manage staff and volunteers, and then if we're so lucky to have a visit from the Premier or the Prime Minister, we want you to organize that too. Now, often in crisis communications plans in municipal governments, that is Mary's job. It'll just be down as Mary is going to do these things or Dave is going to do these things. One person cannot do all those things. So in resource allocation, we think you need about 5 people to manage all of those things. And 2 of those things are directly related to social media. We need content creation and we need to follow and respond to media. So we recommend that you do your communications allocation along this lines. And again, it's not going to become apparent and clear that you need these people unless you weave it into your operational plans. But once you do that, you're going to see that you need about 5 people times 3 shifts, like 3 8 to 10 hour shifts. So you need 10 to 15 people to manage your communications functions. Now, if people balk at that, the fire department has already figured all this out. They know, and that's why they have shared service agreements with other municipal governments. You should think about having some of those things as well. Right? More on that in a minute. In terms of your social media roles, I think you should have one person who's focusing on the strategic advice, strategic decision-making, engagement, and monitoring in real time. And then you have someone else who's creating the content and assisting that person, right? So that's dividing those 2 roles up in a practical way. Now, how do you fill 10 to 15 people? Unless you're very large, you don't have a department of 10 to 15 people to choose from. Many of you on this call are a department of half a full-time equivalent. So how do we make that work? We need to recognize that, you know, the material that we're providing, before I go on to that, I did have this. This is an example from Fort McMurray. We have all the screen captures from the Fort McMurray fire. We just followed along as they went. And when you look at the interaction on that feed, it was really in real time. And this was all done really by about 2 people who were really responding in real time to the community. Now, the notion that you could do that and create a lot of other content and be in all these meetings isn't going to happen. We're going to make these slides available after, but just looking at some of the content that they were getting out using Twitter in Fort McMurray is interesting to look at. Okay. Notice that they did things where they multimedia, where if you didn't catch a news conference, it was available to you on a Dropbox later or through a web link. All right, now who's going to do that? Who's going to do that interaction? You know, I'd get my friend Willie. Willie might work in your municipality, and he's clearly got a fantastic Instagram account. He may not be in communications, but he knows Instagram. He's very good on Facebook, and he kind of understands Twitter. Willie would be the guy. Or it might be John. John is a fisheries biologist with a conservation authority. He may not work for your municipality, but this is a guy who's got drones. He does underwater camera footage. He finds snowy owls in the middle of downtown Toronto. His Facebook feed is spectacular. We need to recruit people like John, and it could be volunteers from your conservation authority, from other public services in your area, or just other municipal employees who are savvy on social media. You're going to deputize these people and throw them into the mix during a crisis. Now, one of the more interesting examples we see of this is where we get people from other provinces helping out during a crisis. So during the Calgary floods, transit related social media staff in Ontario were doing tweeting on behalf of the city of Calgary. They had them live patched into their phone bridge. They got instructions. They knew how to do transit related communication. So people from not just other municipalities, but other province were harnessed to help assist with that communication. So these are networks that you can build up and start to put in place today. And you can do it through shared service agreements where you may be learning how to do it by helping someone else. All right, so we want you to plan and prepare. So, you know, we've talked about training for key people, and that's media training, communications training, and social media training. That's what these webinars are all about, folks. There's 2 more left to go. You may want to drag a few other people into the next 2. Now, some of the apps that we like for just really simple apps for video and editing and images. A lot of you are using Canva, Adobe Spark for, you know, to add text to images, LumaFusion, an app we use extensively for video editing, all of which can be used and delivered on a cell phone. We like decision trees and tools. A lot of the people that you work with in a crisis are engineers and planners, and your operational plans are often rich with that kind of material. If you can turn your communications tools into some decision trees, it would be helpful. One of those components in your decision tree may be if the emergency operations center is triggered, then we need to identify the 15 communications people that will help us over the next few days. All right, identify the people for those roles. All right, we mentioned that we want to embed communications into the operational plans. This is an example of a decision tree. This is one off our, you can get this off our website for whether you respond to a nasty tweet. But this kind of structure of providing communications advice may be a format that the rest of your team responds very well to, because the rest of the operational plans look like this. Other things we like, red light, green light, yellow light models in terms of this is the type of criteria we follow. Right? So this is the kind of thing you can do with Canva or Adobe Spark to just have some basic information to get basic information out. All right, so this would be available on your phone. Now, what to have on your phone? I'm a firm believer that if you're going to do well in crisis communications these days, you want to think, could I deliver all of this from a parking lot in my car over my phone? And if that's the mindset that you have for your base of how you're going to approach communications, you're going to be able to achieve it under tremendous difficulty. Now, probably the hottest topic right now is cyber attacks. If you get a cyber attack, folks, you're going to be managing a crisis situation over your phone from your kitchen or at the side of the road, because all your systems are going to be down. So how do we do that? It would pay to have templates. What we want you to focus on here is the big white space with the municipal logo at the bottom. Once we have this template with the right ratios for different social media accounts, I can use something like Canva to just layer very, very simple text on top of that, right? In terms of what ratios we use, we've got a cheat sheet available for you about all the different ratios for different types of social media accounts, but it pays to understand which formats are right for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. All right, this is the basic core information that went very quickly during Stratford's cyber attack. Very, very simple product. This wasn't designed on a phone, but with some advanced preparation, it could have been. This is how it rolled out on Facebook, or this was on Twitter, where it was just matched up that image to get attention with some basic text. On Facebook, there was a little bit more information with that same tweet card, but what we want you to look at here is, notice 110 shares and no comments. Comments were not turned off. That was the reaction of the community. It's a really good example of one of those first crisis communications principles. You want to very quickly establish what the problem is, frame it, and contain it. And that's what that initial wave of communication has done. We saw a very similar example in Timmins this week. This wasn't actually from the town of Timmins, it was from Moose FM. And because radio stations, particularly small radio stations, tend to just churn out the text from their council. What you got was a post on Moose FM that was pretty much just the resolution that council passed. What was the community's reaction to an issue that is a very, very hot leading issue in Timmins? 9 comments, 161 shares. So it's cauterizing the wound, and it's rippling through the community very, very effectively, and the level of information is manageable for you. All right, so other things we want to have on our phone so that we can do that sort of thing. You want to make sure that you've got key contacts for all your senior staff with alternate email addresses and home phone numbers. Again, if you've got a cyber attack, none of their email addresses are going to work, so you need to know how to reach them through Gmail accounts and everything else. All right, pre-approved photos, just stock photos of sirens or generic shots of your trucks, your snow plows, whatever that might be. You want to have some of these, somebody should have some of these things ready to go on their phone in case we get thrown into a crisis. All right, we've got a list there, a checklist. We're going to provide these slides after. So there's a checklist here of the sorts of things that you can provide information on. But all of that kind of basic information we want to provide to the community can be prepared visually. It's an example of an emergency kit. You're not going to prepare this in the middle of a crisis. You either got it or you don't.
Yeah, and I would say the evacuation one, I think that was one of the second bullets on that other slide. That's an easy thing. Most of you or most of your social service agencies already know where your evacuation centers are going to be. There's no reason why you can't go out and take a shot of that building inside. You can take it at different seasons so that you're prepared. So feel free. So it's important to sort of plan ahead in that sense too. And then you can have a map already ready to go as to where that location is, where the streets meet, where those key intersections are. So those are really easy things to be doing ahead of time, but just need to be thought through.
All right. I know some of the other things on this list is contact information for other service providers. Again, one of the crisis communications principles that we want to follow is to establish in the community where good information comes from. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you've got pre-prepared material that captures visually where those sources are. All right, more on that in a minute. You can cheat a little bit on Twitter and take pictures of text. This is something that was used extensively during the Fort McMurray fire using their Twitter feed. They would often print off a few paragraphs onto a piece of paper and then take a picture of that piece of paper. Alternatively, you could create a Microsoft Word document and then save that Microsoft document, that page, as a JPEG image. You can crop that JPEG image to the size that you need for different social media platforms. It's all quite easy to do, right? And if you've got one person doing interaction on social media and another person doing content creation, then the person who needs the information requests it, someone else designs it, emails it from a computer to your phone, and you can post it from the field over your phone, right? So again, you can provide quite a lot of information on Twitter and get around the limitations on text. The other nice thing about these kinds of pieces is that they're going to ripple and repeat through the community very effectively. You can see in this case, Prince Edward County is not that big. We've got 18 retweets on that.
So one comment just came in here about accessibility. Can you speak to that?
Yes. So, somebody won't like this, but I firmly believe that, in a crisis situation, getting information out is your priority. Keeping people safe and getting people out is the top priority. Now, do we not communicate because it's not accessible? I think we have to concentrate on looking at how do we provide the same information or similar information in alternative needs that is accessible. But I would be hesitant to stop sending information out because it's not accessible. And quite frankly, I would, after the fact, if somebody wants to complain about that after the fact, we will deal with that after the fact, is my view. You really need to make sure that you are getting information out quickly to the community. All right.
The other thing to think about is resources wise. So if you've got somebody creating this type of content, taking pictures of Word documents, whatever, and sending that out through social, you can have another person who is thinking from the accessibility lens and thinking about, okay, well, now we know we have this on social. We've got to make sure now that's available on our website in an accessible format. So it can be done. You need the resources, and that's part of your testing and planning approach, is how are you going to approach the accessibility and who's responsible for that.
I think realistically, we may have identified a sixth person that is almost certainly a partnership with someone else in your community that can provide that accessibility support during an emergency, right? But I would be very hesitant of holding back or failing to communicate information because you're struggling on accessibility. So tackle it in advance if you can, but as a principle, keep information moving. All right, news travels in real time. We know that, and governments don't. Speed also trumps accuracy in terms of people getting information out. People will post information that they think is true before they confirm it. Now, the challenge for governments is governments don't like to communicate until they have everything approved. And in a crisis situation, what tends to happen is things, often common sense things, get tied up in approvals, and we fail to communicate quickly and effectively. The irony of this is, while we're worrying about the precision of text, which is usually what's holding things up, people don't read text anymore. They're all consuming content. So they're getting information that's visual. That's photos, infographics, and video. That's what people are looking for. So there's an opportunity in here. We want to make sure that we have as much pre-approved materials and templates up front as possible so that we don't have to ask for permission to use stuff. It can just go. We've got that criteria information there set up in place, so no one's too surprised. All right. Now, photos and short video with simple text. If you make the shift in your community to start adopting a more visual approach to communication today, the feedback that we consistently hear is that it speeds up approvals on everything else. If you make a great 60-second video on a topic, the approval on that script is quite simple. People see the end result and they love it, and they tell you to do that again. So this notion of moving to more visual communications can also cut through a lot of your approval processes. A lot of text is going to get bogged down. Now, it also pays to have a very clear understanding of who catches direct messages if reporters engage you through Twitter or Facebook, or people ask questions on those platforms. Many of you are set up with a 311 service or 911. We don't want people using Facebook to ask for emergency support, but they will. So understanding how those pieces are going to come together in your organization is very vital. You don't want to be figuring that out in real time. You want to figure that out ahead of time. We've mentioned decision trees and tools. Now, this is a big one for me. I think you should let staff experiment with apps and tools and the equipment that we want them to use, which means you're going to allow them to do that during the day and regular time. So this conservation authority who goes out and gets shots of owls that are really wonderful gifts to our local conservation authority, he does that on weekends and he does it in evenings. I think somebody should have the good sense to send them out in the middle of the day on a nice clear Wednesday and have them really nail it and get really good at it. We're going to pay him to do that. It's good for the conservation authority, but then it's also going to help him refine his skills that he can draw on during a crisis. The other one I like is hobbies, vacations. My family's sick and tired of me, taking the day from our vacation and trying to turn it into a very fast, very slick looking, YouTube video. Now, no one has to see this content, but if you want to learn how to use LumaFusion, the best time to do that was over the winter, the seasonal holidays there. That's the time to really learn what equipment you want to get, what types of things you want to play with, what apps you want to work with. We got Family Day coming up. Family Day is a great time to figure this out. Now, some of you will say, well, that's work off, like I'm not getting paid for that time, right? I kind of feel that if your communications team is not made up of the kind of people that wants to play with apps during Family Day, then they're probably not the people that you want communicating during a crisis situation either. For a crisis situation, you want people who are a little nuts, right? Like we're that way, right? So we want people to get excited about apps. We want people to get excited about different ways to communicate and testing these theories. All right, the next thing we want to do is practice and challenge staff. Learn from your emergency managers, all right? The fire department drills and drills and drills for speed. If you're going to provide communication support during a crisis, you need to pressure yourself to work for speed, right? Now, I think we've got here, this is the Mississauga. In Mississauga, there's been a number of explosions, about 3 explosions over the past 4 or 5 years. They probably don't want me to mention that, but it's true. This was a massive explosion to a house. The mayor got down there and did her traditional thing over social media. But these days, you may not have media that's going to come to your event. So you got to figure out, if you don't have media, how do you replicate this yourself? And the answer is that you're going to be the media and deliver these things, through social media on your own. Now, it is going to require some speed, some things we can look at there. But because Mississauga has had multiple explosions, the last one that they had was about 10 o'clock on a Sunday in a busy intersection in Mississauga. And the city had a news release for that explosion out within half an hour. Now, in my experience, small municipalities are often faster than large municipalities. Mississauga is 750,000 people with lots of approval processes. The new measure of speed, in my view, is the ability for a large municipality like Mississauga to get a news release out in half an hour after an explosion. If they can do that, we can do an awful lot with Twitter. Now, Andrea mentioned the floods in Bracebridge and Graydon Smith. Graydon's used very simple Instagram posts. He used them brilliantly. Now, this image you're looking at is actually video, really dramatic video of swirling, rushing water. And every morning he would go to the same spot and he would show day after day how the river was getting higher and higher and higher. And the next one after this has the caption, "There's a bridge under there," or "There's a dam under there somewhere." Now, these images that he was providing became a daily yardstick that people were checking in on, including the premier. So he got 2 premier's visits during his flood when his neighbors didn't. And people were starting to complain that he was getting all the support and attention, but there were other municipalities that were also affected by floods. And his quick reply to them was, get out and communicate, right? So a lot of what he did was with simple Instagram posts that carried far and wide. And there were only about 8 or 9 of them, but they were very effective. Now, how do we go beyond some of these things? We're talking about cell phone quality images and video, and we think you want to invest in some simple tools, like little simple tripods. They'll help you get better shots. Photo and animation apps, I've mentioned Canva. The other one where a lot of people are working with is Doodly to do basic animation cheaply and quickly. For video editing, we like GoPro Splice, LumaFusion, and Premiere Clip. It's Adobe Premiere Clip. You should post your videos directly to your social media platforms, so directly to Twitter, directly to Facebook. If you have a YouTube channel, great, but you don't want to post it to YouTube and then link it to these other platforms. They won't treat it very well. If you feed it directly through to Facebook, directly through to Twitter, you're going to get a much bigger, more rich video on those feeds, and then their algorithms are going to push that out for you.
So Brian, how much would you say from a budget perspective to get simple tools like either a stabilizer or a little tripod?
Okay.
How much is somebody looking at spending?
So the simple answer to that is we have a lot of free stuff on our resources
Yeah.
section. People are going to think you set me up. There's a lot of free stuff on our resources section, and one of the things we have on there is an equipment list for how we built our selfie station. And it has like a lot of these tools priced out. And if you want an equipment list on other aspects of the equipment we use, that's something we provide regularly. So that's an email to us. Like my office looks like a Best Buy exploded. I've got a budget to experiment that you don't have. It's self-employed. So the reality is we'd be happy to give you advice on some quick and easy, inexpensive tools. Another one we really like, by the way, is a GoPro suction cup mount. Allows you to do an awful lot and would be a handy thing to have in an emergency. Now, if you're doing a news conference, you want to broadcast that news conference live using Facebook Live or Twitter Live, or just basic updates from your emergency officials. In terms of, this is another great example of video. This is a really dramatic, just imagine it, dramatic rushing ice taken from the city of Cambridge, but it was a nice, steady, clear, dramatic shot. And just that little movement really, really captures people's attention. Notice there's 4,500 views of that video and that tweet. So that's massive engagement.
So we have a question if there's a specific gimbal that you recommend, or would you just say look to the list?
Yeah, we'll look to the list. I really like, in terms of gimbals, I like GoPro, the higher end GoPro cameras have built-in image stabilization. So I tend to go there. And I think that the phones are gonna get increasingly better image stabilization. So I don't have a specific gimbal for it. All right, and I also like tripod shots, like just steady, short shots. This would be a good example here. This is about a 30-second clip down by the river with rushing water. You know, as I recall from this shot, it's a nice steady shot. This is one of those moments where you want a simple, small tripod, something like this guy, right? So that's something we can easily take out to the field, use with a cell phone or a tablet or an iPad, and we're gonna get a nice, clear, crisp shot. The phones these days, you can out-compete CTV television if you know what you're doing, right? Everything's there. Now, I've got some of these same mounts here. This is what I'm waving around as an iPad mount. There's a reason why we have an iPad mount. We like teleprompter apps. So more on that in a second, on teleprompter apps. The other thing that I don't really see people doing, but this is one you can practice every day. At the end of your council meeting, why not record a voice note or have your mayor record a voice note on what happened at your council meeting and then email that to the radio reporter who no longer comes to your council meeting. They now have a sound bite, and you can get into a position where you're really feeding your local news to cover your local council with these sound bites. You can do the same thing during a crisis. We've got the Ontario budget coming up. There's a few key radio reporters that I'm going to be sending a clip to after the budget lockup, so they don't have to track us down and find us. They can just go straight to air with that. These clips, of course, you know, once you've got that, if you get it to your local radio station, they're going to do a little piece, and then you're going to share that little piece on your social media accounts. All right. I mentioned teleprompter apps. This is the teleprompter app we use the most. But essentially what we're doing here is we're using Teleprompter Lite. There's a number of these, and a number of them built by the same company. But essentially it does this kind of thing, where we can create a very, very simple script, and we can write it now for the fire that we may have 2 years from now, because the information doesn't change much. If it's an evacuation message, we can prepare that evacuation message as part of our communications plan. We punch it into a cell phone app that turns your cell phone or a tablet into a teleprompter. That text moves, we read the text, and we're captured on the camera. Now, in my experience, fire chiefs, police chiefs, EMS officials, mayors, they have old eyes. So a template or an iPad is better than a phone if you're using one of these apps. It's also exactly the kind of thing that you want to practice during your operational exercise. So we're not showing the people this equipment for the first time during a crisis. They're used to being pulled out of a meeting with a prepared script, and they deliver that prepared script. If that tablet or phone is connected to a cell network, you post it immediately. All right, we think you should work with others. So we mentioned a couple things there about shared service agreements, which the emergency first responders, they know all about this. Communicators should be looking at the same kind of networks so they can ramp up capacity during a crisis. We want safe, shareable, like safe, low risk, shareable content for counselors. Now the old adage is you only have one communicator during a crisis. I would be worried about what the rest of council is doing if they're not given an opportunity to communicate something. right? The devil finds work for idle hands. So what we want to do is make sure those counselors have access to good information that's safe. They know how to share it. They know the principles of how to do a good job of sharing it. And then we patch into their rather extensive networks to make sure that's done. We want you to amplify other sources that are good sources of information, gas company, water utility, school board, right? Help them establish that they are good sources of information. We want you to deputize some of your local staff members or others to help you out. And then you should help out wherever you get a chance to really test your ability to do this stuff quickly. So help out others. Here's just a great example of a counselor in Mississauga sharing good information to establish that the city, the police, and the school board were the best source of information during a very, very difficult time for the community. It involved the murder of a 14-year-old boy, but really what Councillor Karen Rass has done here is her only contribution to this post is update from Peel Police. The rest is just cut and paste text that she's getting out. This is the kind of thing that we want elected officials to do, to know when it's helpful to tap their networks to share information. We want to make sure that we're feeding them information that is shareable, so they've got a constructive, helpful role to play. All right, now, talked about testing your plans. One of the things we want to test is your team's attitude towards the, we're going to layer on some pressure for media, social media, approval processes. And we want to see if your senior managers understand that that's realistic, or if they find those pressures annoying. If they find those pressures annoying during your operational crisis, they will almost certainly retreat into a bunker mentality during a real crisis, right? What we want to get as an attitude from their senior management team is that they recognize that dealing with the perception of fear and emotion and concern in the community through good communication is as important as putting out the fire, turning off the valve, or keeping people safe. All right. So that attitude that your team has during the exercise with respect to communications is one of the things we want to keep a very close eye on when we measure and test our communications plan. Okay, so at the beginning I said, there's some basic things we do in crisis communication. And if we look at the checklist of all the things we want to do, you can see that social media delivers very well on all of those pieces. The one where it's not going to be your go-to is tending to the internal needs and pressures of your employees. But in every other respect, it's going to be a helpful key tool for you. Now, we'll take some more questions in the time that we've got left. How much time we have left? About 10 minutes. That's perfect. Just while you're thinking of your questions, I want to point out we've got 2 other webinars coming up. We try to accomplish a lot in a fairly short period of time. But February 26th, we already have a lot of people registered for When Facebook Attacks, which is pretty much every day. And I think it is a reality that it's become increasingly hard for governments to do things, because as soon as they move in one direction or another direction, a Facebook group rallies up to shut them down and people get nervous and scared. So what do we do when Facebook attacks? Is February 26th. And a lot of what we've been talking about today is creating really fast, gritty, simple content, a lot of it visual, a lot of it, images and video. We've mentioned some apps. We want to do a deeper dive on March 25th of how we actually use those platforms, what equipment we use. There were some questions about equipment today. That's going to be packed into our March 25th creating content webinar. All right. Have any other questions come through?
Nothing at the moment. I will reiterate that piece on the last slide around internal communications. That's one piece that we tend to find gets kind of forgotten when it comes to crisis response. Your employees are really important communicators on behalf of your municipality, and they are also, as residents or members of the community, facing the emergency like everybody else is. So helping them feel that that you've got things under control, that they're part of the solution. They often want to be. They want to be kept informed. Don't forget about them as a key audience. I've been through and have been through emergency situations where the intranet was obviously a really key internal communication tool that was used. You set up a separate page just for that event. So you've got one that's on your website, you've got one that's on your intranet site. So you can provide those regular updates and provide the CAO or whoever is appropriate can be providing regular updates to staff. So they're getting what kind of things are happening, where if staff have been relocated somewhere else because they're handling the crisis situation, who's taking over that role. So they can kind of keep whatever operations they can do on a daily basis, they can keep those going. So don't forget that part of your plan, and part of your practice is how you're going to get those people to keep involved. The other thing too is many of them can be champions on social media for you. Now that depends on your social media policy and how you have staff use that, but keep in mind that they can be really strong advocates and help spread the word as well.
So waiting in the wings here in our webinar studio, we also have Steph Latch, who's our newest recruit. Steph is a former journalist and who has a strange interest in seeing as many Ontario communities as possible. So I would also invite you, if you're doing an operational plan, your regular crisis management exercises, and you want to layer on a communications component, and you want to make it realistic, and you want to have somebody feed in some of that media pressure, some of that social media pressure, that's an assignment that Steph would gladly help you with. Good learning exercise for him as well. So he's throwing things at me with his eyes, but he's good to go. And he really is, he's new to Ontario, so he's interested in seeing a lot of it. There's a lot of ground to cover. I've mentioned our resources section on Red Brick's website. It does have a lot of the references and tools that we've been talking about here. There's a lot of free stuff. You don't have to sign up for anything or whatever. You can just go on there right away and start downloading stuff that you find interesting. But there's things like tools, templates, equipment lists, policies, stuff that we try to be helpful with, including our social media surveys. And if you're looking at the next round of webinars, you can register for those through AMO's website. And I'd add that we welcome feedback on these webinars. So if they're helpful to you, certainly we welcome a star on our fridge if you found it helpful to you. But also if there's other content you'd be looking for us to add to webinars, we've done about 9 different social media topics through a webinar format with AMO. And these will run again next year, I'm sure. If there's content or topics that you would like us to visit, I think one that has come up a few times now is accessibility. So I think we'll take that advice in terms of maybe we should be doing a webinar on how you achieve social media and accessibility and do that quickly. So not a bad topic, but any feedback like that, we absolutely welcome it, and we hope that you found this valuable. All right, any final questions?
I'm not seeing anything else.
All right, folks, I think we're right on our, we've still got a bit of little time. So we'll sit back. If you have any other questions, let us know. But in the meantime, we appreciate your participation and interest today.
Thank you very much.